The White House press room buzzed with the usual pre-briefing chatter, cameras clicking, keyboards clattering, and whispered conversations blending into a low hum. Journalists from across the political spectrum had gathered, their eyes fixed on the podium where Karoline Leavitt, the sharp and confident White House press secretary, would soon address the nation. It was another day in Washington, D.C., but something felt different today. There was a charged tension in the air, an unspoken promise of fireworks. Among the sea of reporters stood Mark Thompson, a rising star at a major liberal network. Tall, broad-shouldered, and known for his aggressive questioning, Mark had built his career challenging conservative politicians and making headlines with his pointed, sometimes confrontational style. He relished the thought of putting officials on the spot, especially those tied to the Trump administration. Mark had heard the whispers in the press corps. Leavitt was sharp, articulate, and unflinchingly loyal to the president. But he wasn't intimidated. In fact, he saw it as a challenge, a chance to score a viral moment and solidify his reputation as a fearless journalist. He had prepped meticulously, armed with questions designed to corner her, to make her stutter, to catch her in a soundbite-worthy slip-up. As the clock struck noon, the heavy wooden doors behind the podium swung open and Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the stage. Her bright, confident smile and composed demeanor projected a calm strength that immediately commanded the room's attention. Dressed in a sharp, navy blue suit, her blonde hair neatly framed her face, and her piercing blue eyes scanned the crowd, instantly reading the mood. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "Today, we'll be covering a range of issues, including the recent economic growth numbers, our ongoing border security efforts, and the president's upcoming meeting with foreign leaders. I'll take your questions now." Mark straightened his jacket, leaning forward as if preparing to pounce. This was his moment. He shot his hand up with practiced urgency, catching Karoline's attention. "Yes, Mark." Karoline acknowledged him, her gaze meeting his with a directness that almost caught him off guard. He cleared his throat, flashing a confident smile that bordered on smugness. "Ms. Leavitt, given the recent criticism about the president's approach to handling the border crisis, do you think it's fair to say this administration has failed to provide a humane and effective immigration policy?" The room fell silent, cameras zoomed in, and a few reporters exchanged glances, sensing the potential for a heated exchange. Mark's question had sharp edges, intentionally loaded to spark controversy. Karoline, however, didn't flinch. She clasped her hands on the podium, leaning in slightly as she responded. "Mark, I appreciate the question, but let's first address the premise. This administration inherited a severely broken immigration system, one plagued by outdated policies and neglected border infrastructure. Under President Trump's leadership, we have worked tirelessly to secure our borders, strengthen our immigration laws, and, most importantly, prioritize American safety and economic stability." Mark's jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't about to let her control the narrative. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "But isn't it true that the humanitarian situation at the border has worsened under this administration's policies? How do you justify separating families and detaining children?" Karoline's eyes narrowed, the subtle spark of a challenge flickering in them. She was clearly prepared for this. "Mark, I understand your concern, but let's not misrepresent the facts. The policies you're referring to were actually put in place by the previous administration, and this president has taken significant steps to reform those practices, ensuring that families are kept together wherever possible while also enforcing our laws. We have to balance compassion with security, a point that often gets lost in these discussions." A few reporters murmured their approval while others typed furiously, sensing the tension building. Mark felt the momentum slipping from his grasp, but he wasn't done yet. He still had a few cards left to play. Mark leaned back for a moment, his mind racing to regain control. He had faced countless press secretaries, but Karoline's unflinching responses were making this exchange more challenging than he had anticipated. He decided to switch tactics, aiming to corner her with a more direct approach. "All right, Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice rising slightly, the edge of frustration creeping in. "You talk about balancing compassion with security, But how do you respond to critics who say this administration's immigration policies are driven more by fear and division than by genuine concern for the welfare of migrants? Karoline paused, allowing the question to hang in the air for a moment, letting its full weight sink in. She had seen this strategy before: paint the administration as heartless, fuel the narrative of a divided America. But she was ready. "Mark," she began, her tone calm but with an unmistakable firmness, "fear and division are the very tools the mainstream media often uses to frame this administration's actions. But let's talk about facts. Under President Trump, we've seen a significant reduction in illegal border crossings, a decrease in human trafficking, and a more secure nation overall. These aren't just talking points, these are the results of enforcing laws that prioritize the safety of our citizens while also respecting the legal immigration process." Mark felt a slight flush creep up his neck. He knew his viewers would expect him to push harder. He leaned in again, his eyes locked on hers. "But isn't it true, Ms. Leavitt, that many of the so-called security measures have come at the cost of human rights and have sparked international criticism? How do you justify that?" Karoline's eyes narrowed, a subtle but unmistakable sign that she wasn't going to let this slide. She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering as she replied, "Let's not confuse enforcing the law with violating human rights. The United States remains one of the most compassionate countries in the world, welcoming more legal immigrants than any other nation. But compassion without security is chaos. We cannot allow our borders to become a free-for-all, risking the safety of American families and undermining the integrity of our legal system. This administration has chosen to stand with the American people, prioritizing their security while working to fix a broken immigration system." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Mark could feel the eyes of his fellow journalists on him, some silently cheering him on, others perhaps wondering if he had finally met his match. But he wasn't done yet. He had one more question, one that he hoped would finally shake her polished composure. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs. "If this administration is so committed to transparency and truth, why do we keep hearing reports of media blackouts at the border and restrictions on what journalists can actually see and report? What are you hiding?" A few cameras clicked rapidly, capturing Karoline's response. She didn't hesitate. Her chin lifted slightly, and her voice took on a sharper edge, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mark, this administration has nothing to hide. We've been transparent about the challenges at the border and the efforts to secure it. What we won't do, however, is allow media narratives to endanger the lives of our Border Patrol agents or compromise ongoing operations. Safety comes first, and if that means limiting certain access for security reasons, then that's a responsible choice, not a cover-up." The room erupted into a flurry of whispered conversations, journalists scribbling notes, some nodding in grudging respect, others shaking their heads in quiet disapproval. Mark clenched his fists under the table, feeling the sting of his failed attempt to corner her. He had expected a stumbling, defensive response, but what he got instead was a masterclass in political deflection and command of the facts. Karoline took a sip of water, her eyes never leaving Mark's, a slight, knowing smile touching the corner of her lips. She had clearly come prepared for this battle, and Mark was beginning to realize that he had underestimated her. Mark felt his heart rate spike. He had walked into this press briefing confident that he could rattle Karoline, but her poised responses were forcing him to recalibrate. He glanced at his notes, fingers tightening around his pen as he tried to regain his footing. He couldn't afford to let her win this round, not with his reputation on the line. "All right, Ms. Leavitt," he began, his tone shifting from aggressive to calculated. "If this administration is so committed to protecting the American people, why did it support cuts to foreign aid programs that help stabilize Central American countries? Isn't it short-sighted to reduce support for the very nations where many of these migrants are fleeing from? Isn't that just fueling the crisis you claim to be solving?" Karoline's eyes sharpened, her head tilting slightly as if she had been waiting for this very line of attack. She straightened, placing both hands on the podium, a subtle but unmistakable display of confidence. "Mark, once again, your question is based on a flawed premise," she responded, her tone steady and precise. "Reducing foreign aid that has historically been mismanaged or funneled into corrupt regimes is not short-sighted, it's responsible governance. This administration has prioritized direct investment in local economies, focusing on building partnerships that promote self-sufficiency rather than creating perpetual dependence on U.S. taxpayers. We believe in empowering these nations to solve their own challenges rather than writing blank checks with little accountability. Mark felt his pulse quicken. She was turning his own question against him, reframing the narrative with the ease of a seasoned debater. He decided to push harder, leaning forward as if physically trying to close the distance between them. But Ms. Leavitt, he pressed, his voice growing sharper, critics say that this empowerment rhetoric is just a cover for abandoning our responsibilities as a global leader. Isn't it true that this approach risks destabilizing the region even further, potentially leading to more waves of desperate migrants at our border? Karoline's smile was small but unmistakable, a flicker of amusement that Mark couldn't miss. She had clearly anticipated this line of questioning. Mark, she replied, her tone now tinged with a hint of challenge, let's be clear, the United States remains the most generous nation on earth when it comes to humanitarian aid. But throwing money at the problem without demanding real, measurable reforms is not a solution. It's a band-aid. This administration believes in tackling the root causes of migration, not just managing the symptoms. That means pushing for economic stability, reducing corruption, and supporting the rule of law in these countries, not just writing checks and hoping for the best. The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark felt his face flush slightly, a wave of frustration washing over him. He had come prepared to expose cracks in her arguments, but instead he felt like the one on the defensive. Before he could formulate a follow-up, Karoline leaned into the microphone, her eyes never leaving his. You see, Mark, leadership isn't just about handing out money and expecting loyalty. It's about setting high standards, demanding accountability, and ensuring that American taxpayers see real, lasting results for their generosity. If that makes this administration controversial in your eyes, so be it. But we won't apologize for putting the interests of our citizens first. A few quiet gasps rippled through the room, followed by a brief, awkward shuffling as some reporters shifted in their seats. Mark felt a pang of irritation, his confidence now visibly shaken. He had hoped to catch Karoline off guard, but instead, she was schooling him in front of his peers, flipping each of his attacks back on him with a calm, practiced precision. Karoline glanced at her watch, the small gesture making it clear that she had other things to attend to. But as she looked back at Mark, the faintest hint of a smirk crossed her lips, as if she were silently daring him to try again. Mark swallowed hard, his confidence visibly shaken. He could feel the eyes of his fellow journalists burning into him, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled amusement. He couldn't afford to back down now. His reputation was at stake. Taking a deep breath, he decided to take a different angle, one that was more personal, less policy-driven. Ms. Leavitt, he began, forcing a smile to mask his frustration. You talk about leadership and putting Americans first, but doesn't this administration's stance on issues like climate change suggest otherwise? Rolling back environmental regulations and pulling out of international agreements. How is that in the best interest of the American people, especially when we're facing unprecedented natural disasters? Karoline's expression remained unchanged, calm and composed as ever. Mark, climate policy under this administration has been guided by a commitment to both economic growth and environmental stewardship. We don't believe in sacrificing American jobs and energy independence for policies that, frankly, have proven to be economically disastrous. The president has always prioritized pragmatic, balanced approaches rather than radical shifts that harm working families. Mark's irritation flared. He was used to his questions leaving officials scrambling for words, not delivering prepared-sounding speeches. He decided to press harder. But how do you explain the increasing frequency of hurricanes, wildfires, and other climate-related disasters? He countered. Many experts argue that rolling back environmental protections only makes these situations worse. Is the administration ignoring science in favor of short-term economic gains? Karoline's gaze intensified, and for the first time, her voice took on a slightly sharper edge. Mark, the assumption that every natural disaster is directly linked to the administration's policies is both misleading and irresponsible. Climate change is a complex global challenge that requires innovation, not just regulation. This administration has invested heavily in clean energy technology, carbon capture initiatives, and resilient infrastructure. But we won't endorse policies that destroy jobs and cripple industries in the name of symbolic gestures. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Karoline wasn't just holding her ground, she was turning his question into an opportunity to showcase the administration's achievements. Mark felt his palms sweat. He needed to regain control, and fast. Sensing the shift, Mark tried a more emotional approach. But Ms. Leavitt, isn't it true that communities in states like California and Florida feel abandoned? They're dealing with unprecedented wildfires and hurricanes, yet this administration seems more concerned about deregulation than addressing their urgent needs. Karoline's posture straightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. That's simply not true, Mark. The administration has provided billions in disaster relief, supported rebuilding efforts, and worked closely with state and local governments to ensure aid is delivered efficiently. What we refuse to do is exploit natural disasters to push partisan climate agendas. Our focus remains on practical solutions that safeguard both the environment and the economy. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Karoline continued, her tone more pointed than before. And let's be clear about something, politicizing natural disasters to score points isn't just dishonest, it's disrespectful to the people who are suffering. This administration believes in real action, not empty rhetoric. So if you're truly concerned about these communities, I suggest focusing on how we can work together to build resilient infrastructure instead of spreading misleading narratives. A wave of surprise swept through the room. Mark could feel his credibility slipping. He was used to dominating the room, steering the narrative, but Karoline had not only defended her points but had also subtly questioned his integrity. He glanced around, noticing that some reporters were now focusing more on her than on him. As Karoline moved on to the next question from another reporter, Mark sat back, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't shake the growing realization that he had underestimated her. He had walked into this briefing thinking he could force her into a corner, but instead, she had deftly turned the tables, making him look unprepared and reactionary. For the first time in his career, Mark Thompson felt genuinely humbled in front of the cameras. He wasn't sure whether to feel anger or respect, but one thing was certain, Karoline Leavitt wasn't just a spokesperson, she was a formidable adversary. As the briefing came to a close, the room buzzed with quiet conversations and the sound of reporters packing up their equipment. Mark sat back, exhausted and contemplative. The arrogant certainty he had carried and walked in had been chipped away piece by Karoline Leavitt's calm, unwavering responses. This was not the showdown he had imagined. After the official session ended, Karoline remained at the podium answering a few final questions. Mark lingered near the back, watching her with a mix of frustration and newfound respect. When the last reporter left, she gathered her notes and approached him. "Mark," she said quietly but with a smile, "you asked some tough questions today. I appreciate that. It's important to challenge the administration." Mark nodded, surprised by her tone. "Thank you, Ms. Leavitt. I came in thinking I had this figured out, but you really made me rethink a few things." She chuckled softly. "That's the point of dialogue, isn't it? To challenge assumptions and grow. It's easy to get caught up in our own narratives." Mark exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in hours. "I guess I let my bias get the better of me. I assumed you'd be defensive or evasive, but you handled everything with grace and facts. Honestly, I've learned a lot just watching you." Karoline nodded, eyes kind but serious. In journalism and in politics, it's easy to forget that behind every question and answer are people trying to do what they believe is best. We don't always agree, but respect and honesty go a long way. Mark extended his hand. "Thank you for the lesson, Karoline. I hope we can continue this conversation, maybe with less confrontation and more understanding." She shook his hand firmly. "I'd like that." As Mark left the briefing room that day, he realized his role wasn't just to challenge or expose, but to listen and learn. Karoline Leavitt had not just defended the administration. She had reminded him of the power of respectful discourse and the importance of seeking truth beyond headlines. The arrogant liberal reporter walked away a little humbler, a little wiser, and ready for a new approach to journalism.